So, the 3 full years of stupid press coverage of Kamala Harris has finally come to an end. After 3 years of Washington reporters churning over the question of what's wrong with Kamala Harris, last night they finally got their answer. Nothing. Nothing's wrong with Kamala Harris. Nothing ever was. They didn't think she could do this. Here's just a sample of headlines covering the vice presidency of Kamala Harris. The BBC, Kamala Harris, 1 year. Where did it go wrong for her? The Washington Post, a Kamala Harris staff exodus reignites questions about her leadership style and her future ambitions. The New York Times, Kamala Harris is trying to define her vice presidency. Even her allies are tired of waiting. This headline from Politico, not a healthy environment. Kamala Harris' office rife with dissent. And the biggest, longest article of all from The Atlantic, the Kamala Harris problem. Few people seem to think she's ready to be president. Why? Why? Maybe because the Washington news media had been doing everything it possibly could to deliver the message that Kamala Harris was not ready for the presidency for 3 full years. If you spent 1 minute reading any of those articles, you wasted that minute. And if you were forced professionally to spend more than a minute, as I was, you learned nothing about the real Kamala Harris, which is the whole point of those articles. The conceit of that kind of journalism is that the reporter can get the inside story about who Kamala Harris really is, how she really operates, and how we should value her as a political player. These articles are supposed to tell you whether she can someday do what we all saw her do last night, and none of those articles predicted. This program has been covering Kamala Harris longer than all of the news organizations whose headlines we just read. She first appeared on this program when she was the district attorney of San Francisco, and she last appeared on this program in December, when a dump Harris movement was brewing. At that time, there were some who thought the way to deal with Joe Biden's age in the re-election campaign was to get a different vice presidential candidate who the country was able to see as a strong potential president, because obviously, according to the pushers of this theory, no one could ever see Kamala Harris that way. And as I've said repeatedly on this program, I saw Kamala Harris as a potential presidential candidate and a potential president the day I met her in a small group meeting in Los Angeles in 2009. It was that obvious then. Viewers of this program have repeatedly had the opportunity to see Kamala Harris that way as a potential president. And I would hope that faithful viewers of this program were not at all surprised by what they saw on the debate stage last night. Vice President Harris being the same person she's always been, easily crushing the 78-year-old convicted felon standing across the room from her, afraid to ever even look at her. Both of those candidates on the debate stage last night were exactly who they have always been. In December, on this program, the Vice President offered us a preview of some of what we heard last night. I asked the Vice President then what she thought about Donald Trump saying that immigrants, like her parents, poisoned the blood of our country.
I was raised, as you know, a child of parents who were active in the civil rights movement. And I was raised knowing that there will be some people who will use their voice in a way that is meant to dehumanize. Meant to suggest that the vast majority of us don't have anything in common, when in fact the vast majority of us have more in common than what separates us. And I would interpret it, I think, then as I do now, which it is language that is meant to divide us. It is language that I think people have rightly found similar to the language of Hitler. And I think it's just critically important that we remind each other, including our children, that the true measure of the strength of a leader is based not on who they beat down, but who they lift up. And sadly, I think that there's something perverse that has happened in our country over the last many years, which is to suggest that strength looks like a bully, when in fact the real character of a leader is someone who has empathy, who has some level of concern and care for the suffering of other people, and then does something to alleviate that suffering.
One important Democrat told me that that night in that interview on this program was the first time that he could really see Kamala Harris as a president. Here's some of what the vice president said in that interview about reproductive freedom, some of which you heard her say last night.
This is about real people every day suffering, and many of them suffering silently. We just saw the young woman, Kay Cox, and what happened to her. You're on at 10 o'clock at night, so I'm going to assume that adults are watching, Lawrence. And we have to be real on this. In our country right now, there are women having miscarriages in toilets. There are women who cannot afford to go to a state that will allow them access to the health care they need, who are suffering. There's only one state in the South, and that's Virginia, that still has retained a law that allows a woman to make decisions about her own body. And so this is an issue that, yes, I do believe will be resolved in November of next year, because I do know that the American people fight for freedom and believe in the woman's right to make decisions about her own body.
They were writing the What's Wrong with Kamala Harris articles then, when she was delivering interviews like that on this program. She was the same person you saw last night. That's the same person that I first heard speak in 2009 and the same person on that debate stage last night. Nothing changed. But what we all saw on the debate stage last night was a big surprise to all those reporters and editors who've been churning out all of those articles about Kamala Harris for the last 3 years. A big surprise to most of the Washington press corps, who could not clearly see the person who was right in front of them for those 3 years. Here's another part, and I'm showing you this only because of how important it is, the way the vice president has been covered the last 3 years, why it feels like a surprise to so many people that she was so strong last night. And here's another part of Vice President Harris's role in the world that was completely ignored by most of those articles that turned out to be so wrong about Kamala Harris.
Zambia, Your Excellency, the Vice President of the United States of America, Madam Kamala Harris. Please feel at home. I'm so happy that you're President. All of you young leaders are part of what I dream about. Yeah! Make me so confident in the future. We love you!
From the moment that I saw that video, I've been waiting to ask you, what did that moment feel like?
It was pure joy. You know, it's, we all hope in our lives that we can have an impact in a way that hopefully inspires or gives people a sense of confidence in what is possible for themselves and then who they love in their community. And it was very special, Lawrence. It was very special. And thanks for sharing that clip. I hadn't seen that. It was very special. And, you know, you've heard me say many times, you know, my mother would say to me, Kamala, you may be the first to do many things, make sure you're not the last. And to have, and I have been fortunate and blessed to, during the course of being vice president, have many situations where it becomes clear to me that there are, you know, people of every age and gender, by the way, who see something about being the first that lets them know they don't need to be limited by other people's limited understanding of who can do what. And I think that's important. And it relates to all people. And so thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you.
That should not have been the first time the vice president was seeing that video. It should have been everywhere. I had shown that video on this program 9 months before that, but I didn't see it anywhere else because the political press wasn't really trying to report on what Kamala Harris was really doing as vice president. They were simply trying to collect gossip and sell it to you as wisdom and insight about who Kamala Harris really is. And it was worse with the right-wing media, of course. On Fox, a venomous Republican senator from Louisiana said last year, quote, "The vice president needs to work on being a little more articulate. English is not her first, second, third, or even fourth language." The movement to replace Joe Biden on the ticket was also always a movement to replace Kamala Harris on the ticket. One of the earliest and certainly the wisest leaders of the Replace Biden movement was Ezra Klein, who in February in the New York Times wrote, quote, "Everybody I have talked to about this, literally everybody has brought up the same fear. Call it the Kamala Harris problem. In theory, she should be the favorite, but she polls slightly worse than Biden. Democrats don't trust that she would be a stronger candidate, but they worry that if she wasn't chosen, it would rip the party apart." Ezra Klein suggested a large group of Democrats should compete for the nomination if President Biden stepped down, and Kamala Harris, in Ezra's judgment, probably wouldn't win that nomination. Ezra Klein was, of course, smart enough to admit that the contested convention scenario could go very badly. My only contribution to the Replace Biden scenarios when they were being discussed was that the only possible alternative nominee to Joe Biden, as I saw it, was Kamala Harris. And that's the way it turned out. When Joe Biden dropped out and 27 minutes later endorsed Kamala Harris, and within hours, Kamala Harris had enough delegates to secure the nomination. So they were wrong about Kamala Harris's abilities. They were wrong about what would happen if Joe Biden dropped out of the race. And they were very, very wrong about what would happen with Kamala Harris on the presidential debate stage this year. Donald Trump was no doubt one of the big believers of that large pile of journalistic trash that was churned out about Vice President Harris. And so I think, along with most of the Washington press corps, we can count Donald Trump as one of the people who was very surprised by what happened on that debate stage last night. For every presidential candidate prior to Donald Trump, the debate stage has revealed next to nothing about how they would actually handle the job of the presidency. The debates definitely reveal some policy differences, but they usually don't reveal much more about the person. Every debate Donald Trump has ever participated in has revealed that he does not know how to be president of the United States. And last night's debate, thanks to Kamala Harris, revealed that he does not know how to be a human being, beginning with the entrance of the candidates. Donald Trump obviously entered with a plan to not shake hands. Vice President Harris obviously entered with the opposite plan, and she took full charge of that moment, very much against Donald Trump's will.
So let's now welcome the candidates to the stage, Vice President Kamala Harris and President Donald Trump.
Kamala Harris, let's have a good debate.
Nice to see you. Have fun.
Thank you.
Welcome to you both.
Trump enters, you see there timidly and slowly on the left side of your screen, thinking that maybe slowing his walk down would somehow give him a later, cooler entrance. But Kamala Harris, 20 years younger, strides in purposefully, straight for Donald Trump, and instantaneously establishes domination over him. We're going to do this my way, is the subtext of what she is saying to Donald Trump with that outstretched hand. And then for 90 minutes, she spoke directly to the American people, sometimes directly to Donald Trump, to her right. And when she wasn't speaking, she was always turning and listening to Donald Trump the way a human being would, and to, in her way, emphasize by her listening the absurdity of what Donald Trump was saying with her human reactions to what she was hearing. Donald Trump chose two modes at the podium. the angry and bitter 78-year-old man while he was speaking, and the mugshot face while he was listening. He did not once dare to turn and look at the Vice President of the United States when she was speaking, just mugshot face. He wasn't looking at the moderators either. He wasn't looking at us through the camera. He was looking at nothing, just lost in the wilderness of his own confusion of what was happening to him. And what was happening to him was that he was being beaten much worse than any losing candidate in any presidential debate in history. What you saw in Kamala Harris was simply the most overwhelmingly strong performance by a presidential debater in the history of presidential debates, which began only in 1960, so it isn't very long. You can watch every one of them online. Most presidents never debated anyone. I believe John Kerry, I'm sure John Kerry won all three of his debates against George W. Bush. I'd never seen a better presidential debater. But John Kerry didn't win those debates by some giant margin, the giant margin Kamala Harris won by last night. There are no great memorable lines from the winners of presidential debates until now.
I have talked with military leaders, some of whom worked with you, and they say you're a disgrace.
Young people might not know that prior to the political career of Donald Trump, no candidate in a presidential debate ever dreamed of saying that the other candidate is a disgrace. That could not happen until Donald Trump brought his life of crime and disgrace to the presidential debate stage. Last night, Donald Trump lied to the voters about the voters when he claimed that everyone wanted Roe versus Wade to be overturned. Donald Trump claimed that everyone, Democrats, Republicans, independents, everyone watching the debate, wanted Roe versus Wade to be overturned, even though an overwhelming majority of the American people did not want Roe versus Wade to be overturned. And so, after Donald Trump lied to the American people about the American people and what they wanted, Vice President Harris said this.
Donald Trump certainly should not be telling a woman what to do with her body. I have talked with women around our country. You want to talk about this is what people wanted? Pregnant women who want to carry a pregnancy to term, suffering from a miscarriage, being denied care in an emergency room because the healthcare providers are afraid they might go to jail, and she's bleeding out in a car in the parking lot. She didn't want that. Her husband didn't want that. A 12 or 13-year-old survivor of incest being forced to carry a pregnancy to term? They don't want that. And I pledge to you, when Congress passes a bill to put back in place the protections of Roe v. Wade, as President of the United States, I will proudly sign it into law.
The same person. That was the same person I first heard speak in 2009. That was the same person you heard on this program in December. There was nothing surprising about any of that, except to the people who were never paying attention to the real Kamala Harris. Donald Trump's response to that was, of course, a lie.
They have abortion in the 9th month. They even have, and you can look at the governor of West Virginia, the previous governor of West Virginia, not the current governor, who's doing an excellent job, but the governor before, he said the baby will be born and we will decide what to do with the baby. In other words, we'll execute the baby.
There is no state in this country where it is legal to kill a baby after it's born. Madam Vice President, I want to get your response to President Trump.
Imagine, in that moment, the panic workings of the mind of that raging racist being corrected on that debate stage last night by 2 black women. The racism that Donald Trump grew up with told him, promised him, that that kind of thing could never happen to him.